This is a story of remembrance and forgetting in equal measure. It begins a century ago, soon after the outbreak of the First World War, with the building of a military hospital in Cambridge. The first Eastern General was described as a small town. It had its own post office, shop, tennis courts, even a cinema. At its peak, it had 1,700 beds. More than 70,000 casualties of the Great War passed through its doors here on the Backs in Cambridge, on the exact site of what has become one of its most recognisable buildings, the University Library. The new library was opened by King George V on October the 22nd, 1934. Among the crowd of flag-waving children lining the streets that day was Cambridge author Philomena Guibault.
We were very excited, and it was the first royals I'd ever seen, and we all cheered when the large limousine came by, and we saw them very, very clearly.
Some 70 years later, when Philomena was working on a study of West Cambridge, she was shown an Ordnance Survey map of 1927.
And I saw this peculiar shape, and I thought, that's very odd, doesn't look like the University Library footprint. Anyhow, the University Library wasn't built for 7 years afterwards, so what was this?
Despite having lived much of her life less than half a mile away, Philomena, like many other local people, was totally unaware there had ever been a military hospital on this site. Driven by curiosity, she began to uncover its story, a story that had waited almost a century to be told.
I was astonished that something which was the biggest contribution which Cambridge made to the war effort. I mean, it sent all its young people, but that was true of the rest of the country. And as far as Cambridge itself was concerned, this hospital was really the biggest contribution that it made. And it was astonishing to me that it could have been so completely obliterated from people's memories.
Within days of the outbreak of war on August 4th, 1914, Cambridge was transformed into a garrison town by the arrival of thousands of troops.
In 1914, the end of 1914, the beginning of 1915, saw the biggest influx of soldiers into town, which had to be accommodated somewhere. It was like being invaded, and being invaded by a friendly force. Large encampments by the river, so that horses and so on had immediate access to water. The soldiers themselves often bathed in the river, and people saw it as a tourist attraction. They were amazed. They came out in the evening, they walked to the encampments, they took things, presents, gifts to the soldiers, they chatted to the soldiers.
Local people also volunteered at the camps, setting up tents for refreshments or letter writing, or selling supplies such as matches, stamps and soap. The army requisitioned many public and university buildings. The market square, athletics grounds and even boathouses were taken over for military use. There were frequent inspections of troops and constant drilling of recruits on Parker's Piece, where not a blade of grass remained. To some people, the endless processions of gun carriages and Red Cross ambulances, the churned-up roads and continual tramp of men through the town was deeply unsettling. But for others, the young in particular, these unfamiliar sights and sounds inspired excitement and a sense of adventure. While the troops slept under canvas or were billeted in town, the officers were enjoying the hospitality of the colleges and dined in khaki at high tables. With the exception of the two women's colleges, Girton and Newnham, the student population fell by as much as 90%. Many university teaching staff enlisted or took up commissions for specialist war work. In September 1914, Cambridge opened its doors to a flood of Belgian refugees, including students and academics who were offered hospitality within the university. Most college buildings and their playing fields were taken over by the Officer Training Corps and later Officer Cadet battalions. In the absence of undergraduates, it was the cadets who now kept the spirits and traditions of college life going. When the First Eastern Hospital was mobilised on August 5, 1914, it was housed temporarily in the Lees School on Trumpington Road. It was fully equipped and staffed with operating rooms, wards and dispensaries. Even the Games Committee shed was converted into a mortuary. As the autumn term approached, however, and the buildings were needed by the school, the hospital transferred to Trinity College. Here, in a matter of days, the historic cloisters of Neville's Court were transformed into open-air wards with beds for 250 men. Tents and marquees sprang up on the lawn and the paddocks on both sides of the river. Local people gathered in Garrett Hostel Lane and on the bridge, chatting to the convalescent soldiers in their distinctive bright blue uniforms and throwing them sweets and cigarettes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the backs, on a 10-acre former cricket field belonging jointly to Clare and King's colleges, the construction of a temporary emergency hospital was well underway. The building was ready for its first patients on October the 17th, 1914.
The incredible speed with which it was built, I mean, it really came up like a mushroom. And that's what startled me when I did my first cursory work. The thing was opened for patients 10 weeks after the start of the First World War. The hospital was actually mobilized on the 5th of August, and the first patients came in on the 17th or so of October, which, when you consider, you had to put in drains, because there were no drains on that site. You had to bring in all the utilities. You had to build the thing. You had to equip it. You had to put the heating system and the water supply and all the rest of it. I mean, that it could have been done in 10 weeks was simply amazing.
The astonishing speed of construction was the result of highly detailed forward planning by the War Office going back to 1908. The First Eastern was the first and largest of a national network of territorial hospitals to be mobilised in the event of war. The railway and the existing medical facilities at Addenbrooke's made Cambridge an ideal location. The hospital's architect, Charles Frederick Skipper, and its builder, Arthur Negus, were both local men. The building was utilitarian in both design and construction, a series of prefabricated wooden huts clad in sheets of asbestos and a felt-covered roof. Much was made of the fact that it cost only £25,000 to build and was a model of economy and efficiency, as well as employing the most up-to-date and pioneering medical practices. So what was life like in this small town with a population of 2,000 souls which had sprung up so quickly on the backs? In the Cambridgeshire collection in Cambridge Central Library is an extraordinary set of glass negatives. They were taken by the First Eastern's official photographer and record almost every aspect of daily life here. Many were produced commercially as postcards and sold in the hospital and in newsagents in town. These official views show calm, neat-looking wards, bright with flowers and floral counterpanes, flourishing gardens and relaxed-looking patients and staff. They seemed calculated to soften the austerity of the huts and the unavoidable evidence of suffering. More complex insights into hospital life can be gleaned from its official magazine, the First Eastern Gazette. The Gazette, apparently the first of its kind, was published twice monthly until February 1917, and it had a circulation of several thousand. Contributions included humorous articles, poems, drawings, and general grousing about ward life. Despite obvious censorship, the Gazette reveals much about the states of mind of both patients and staff, and the underlying tensions of a military hospital regime. Dr. Anna Carden-Coyne is co-director of the Centre for the Cultural History of War at Manchester University.
And in some ways, the medical staff, the nurses, even the VOTs were sort of co-opted into that regime. They also had authority over the male body. And for a lot of men, this is, of course, not what they expected. They expected that they would be cared for, that nurses would treat them in a more or less maternal or sisterly way. So there's some tensions that get played out in the hospital with that disciplinary culture.
The hospital's main entrance was on Burrell's Walk off Queen's Road, or the Backs, with vehicle access for ambulances and deliveries. The huts housed at least 24 wards in rows running east to west. Each was a self-contained unit with up to 60 beds and 3 bathrooms serving 2 wards. A central spine connected each ward to the kitchens, operating theatre and administrative buildings. There were no stairs anywhere in the hospital. The First Eastern struggled to keep up with the constantly shifting demand for beds, which was at times overwhelming. By the summer of 1915, 2 auxiliary hospitals for patients with venereal disease had been opened in Barnwell and Cherry Hinton and relieved some of the pressure on the First Eastern. But during the Great Push of summer 1916, the War Office requisitioned another 1,000 beds, and the hospital expanded into marquees and even school buildings in town to cope with the increasing casualties. The First Eastern was not only a cheap and efficient hospital building, it was also an experiment in large-scale and extended open-air treatment. When first built, the south side of each ward was completely open, with only a canvas blind as protection, and all the beds faced south. The First Eastern's commanding officer, Colonel Joseph Griffiths, a surgeon at Addenbrooke's, played a key role in its design. A man of abounding energy and enthusiasm, he had an almost fanatical belief in the curative value of direct sunlight and pure air. Griffiths had many powerful allies in Cambridge. One of them was Dr. Arthur Shipley, Master of Christ's College and later Vice-Chancellor of the University. In 1915, Shipley, a zoologist, published a study of parasites and their impact on the army, entitled The Minor Horrors of War. He also published a pamphlet on the First Eastern and the open-air treatment of the wounded. The patients, Shipley argued, never complain of suffering from the cold, but after life in the trenches, look on the hospital as a paradise. There was nothing unique to the First Eastern about open-air wards, particularly in the treatment of TB, and many Army medical staff were agreed on the benefits. The continual exposure to the elements was tough on both patients and staff. There were problems with flies, mice, rats and other incursive animals, a jackdaw that stole men's cigarettes, a stray cat that ate the leeches intended for patients. The flapping canvas blinds kept patients awake, and it proved impossible to black out the huts against night raids by Zeppelins. The winter of 1914 to 15, with widespread storms and floods, was particularly testing, and the following winter, braziers were installed outside the wards. Finally, in the autumn of 1916, following a report by the Commission of Inquiry, all but 4 of the wards were enclosed and stoves installed inside. For many soldiers in the trenches, receiving a blighty, a light wound, and being sent back home to recover was perhaps their greatest hope.
There was a mythology around the blighty wound and a kind of cultural mythology around it too, and there's lots of patient poetry and patient cartoons about the blighty wound. But the reality was that most patients were sent back. They had very high rotation rates. The military was very proud of its record in rotating patients back to the front, because this showed good, effective, modern medicine, treating patients quickly and getting them back to the front.
When the wounded men arrived at the hospital, they might be covered in lice, their uniforms matted with blood, mud and pus, and with frostbitten fingers and toes.
They also would have had infected wounds, which would be from tetanus or streptococcus or gas gangrene. And gas gangrene was called the so-called stinking wound because of its foul-smelling nature. It upset the patients, it upset the nurses. It was a very rapidly spreading disease. It would get through the body within 24 hours and often ended in amputation, largely.
We can learn much about the men's physical and mental states when they arrived at the hospital from the testimonies of those who looked after them.
Well, it's awfully difficult to describe it, really. The shrapnel wounds are quite different to the bullet wounds. Bullet wounds nearly always affected some organ or other, you know, that went right through them, but the shrapnel sort of, well, it sort of just took off they were just raw to the bone, a lot of them, you know, blown. It's indescribable, really, some of the wounds.
For the most badly wounded men, there was the bath ward, or the aquarium, in which they lived and slept continuously for several days or weeks.
No dressing would have done them any good at all, and they were in unbearable pain. So one thing about it, they were very cheerful and pleased to get home. But this bath ward, it was one big, like a big swimming pool, really. And they used to put them on these lilos as gently as they could. They lowered them down in a sort of net thing onto these lilos very carefully, and had these saline drips going through the bath the whole time, which got rid of all that sloughy stuff, which helped them a great deal. And they were given saline drips to feed them too, because a lot of them couldn't take food.
Many visitors came specifically to see the bath ward. Its cutting-edge thermal control apparatus was provided by the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company.
Because of the sort of fame of the bath ward, there was an enormous amount of curiosity about the hospital, and some patients almost resented the amount of attention that the wounded received, and they felt like they were sort of on show, they were kind of spectacles. So that sense in which the wounded were both heroised but also inspected and under surveillance and perhaps a little bit harassed at times.
Massage therapy, then relatively new in application to war wounds, was an important element of orthopaedic surgery and another frequent source of patient complaints. In Cambridge, much of this treatment was done by local women after a short intensive training. One of these was Margaret Darwin, later Keynes, granddaughter of Charles Darwin, who worked as a volunteer in St Chad's Convalescent Hospital in Grange Road. Several members of staff from Newnham College, which gave up its own gymnasium for the treatment of outpatients, also trained as masseurs. Newnham geologist Gertrude Ellis was commandant of the Red Cross Hospital in Wordsworth Grove, one of a network of convalescent hospitals set up in private houses and other buildings to which patients from the First Eastern might be transferred. To start with, many of the staff at the First Eastern came from Addenbrooke's Hospital. The trained nurses were assisted by women from the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VADs as they were known. Many were young local women, keen to do their bit for the war as volunteers. Although they worked side by side, there were sometimes tensions between the two groups of women, and social and professional boundaries were strictly maintained. Whilst the staff nurses were accommodated in the empty undergraduate rooms of King's College, the VADs were housed separately in Selwyn, both only a short distance from the hospital. Despite their inexperience, the duties of these nursing assistants, like those of the staff nurses, involved long hours and gruelling tasks.
And it always meant two of you had got to cope with them, really, each case because they were terribly bad. The lifting and everything was very heavy. So really you had a long round in the morning of dressings and that sort of thing. And of course lots of amputations, lots of hemorrhages from the amputations which had to be stopped. Blood transfusions and that sort of thing went on. It all took a lot of time. We used to so hate going in the morning, and someone you might have quite liked and looked after quite a lot the day before. In the morning you'd go in and see these screens round their bed and you knew they'd gone. But actually the nurses hadn't very much time to think about all this, fortunately. That was one blessing. If you'd had time to sit and think about it, you would have been in an awful state of wretchedness, and at night when you went home to bed you were so tired you just didn't have time to think much.
In April 1917, many staff from the First Eastern were sent to France to set up a new hospital there, leaving behind an acute shortage of trained staff. Medical students, among the few undergraduates still in Cambridge, were already working on the wards of the First Eastern as dressers. And it seems that some of them, like Newnham's student Ruth Dingley, recorded in 1988, might also be called upon to assist in the endless round of operations, sometimes as many as 50 a day.
I watched for about a week in intervals of going outside to faint, as I kept doing. At the end of a week I stopped fainting. I've still got my notes of all the operations I saw done. It was my first introduction to medicine, and then it was handed over to me to give anaesthetics. It's unbelievable. I hadn't done a word of clinical practice of any sort, you see.
So some people were meant to finish their medical degrees, some people didn't finish their medical degrees, but yes, medical students were used. And although they weren't meant to obviously conduct operations or even administer anaesthetics, they did. Of course they did, because in some circumstances they were desperate for people with medical knowledge.
As in all World War I military hospitals, local people did a great deal to help make the soldiers' stay as comfortable and cheerful as possible. A wide range of entertainments, theatricals, lantern slide lectures and concerts were laid on in the large recreation room, which even had its own fireplaces. The hospital was given a cinematograph machine, and there were also gramophones in the wards. For those well enough, there were rugby, football, even boxing matches played against the staff or patients in the convalescent hospitals nearby. In the carpenter's workshop, donated by a fellow of King's College, men made crutches and walking sticks, as well as items of furniture, under the supervision of Charles Benton. Even those confined to bed were not permitted to be inactive. A wide range of crafts such as knitting, crochet and needlework were encouraged to aid the healing process. Their handiwork was frequently exhibited and sold to raise money for materials. At busy times, the First Eastern might receive up to 1,000 visitors a day. Rudyard Kipling was one such visitor, as were several members of the royal family. One of King George V's longer visits, in August 1916, was later published as an illustrated souvenir. It made much of the King's personal interest in the workings of this modern military hospital. The First Eastern's impact on Cambridge was felt in many different ways. Like the soldiers in khaki or convalescent blue, it was a constant, unavoidable reminder of what was happening in France. The once peaceful backs were transformed by convoys of noisy, motorised ambulances, deliveries of food, coal, laundry, and an endless stream of visitors. For many local businesses, tailors and bootmakers, tobacconists and taxi drivers, pubs, hotels and lodging house keepers, this large military presence provided some commercial compensation for the absence of students. Some people found employment in the hospital as clerical workers or domestic staff. Equally important, perhaps, it provided a range of voluntary opportunities for townspeople to do their bit. They could take patients out for a walk, or a drive, or on the river, entertain them at home, or just treat them like heroes on the streets. Others offered the hospital the use of a private vehicle, or volunteered as ambulance drivers, transporting the wounded from Cambridge railway station, a journey of a mile or so. Percy North, recorded in 1976, was a stretcher bearer for the Red Cross.
You were perhaps getting ready for bed and the rap at the door. Headquarters as soon as possible, convoy expected. Will you inform so-and-so? Well, there's no transport on your bicycle those days. You went and warned the other people and got to your headquarters, loaded the stretchers and blankets if they weren't already loaded, and then marched to the station. And prepare the stretchers, blanket them, get them all ready. Convoy delayed, be another 2 hours. We could hang about 2 hours. Well, sometimes we've been on all night long, got back perhaps between 6 and 7 in the morning. We finished and gone straight the way to work.
There's no doubt that the First Eastern brought the town and university into a new, perhaps unprecedented proximity, and social interactions of a new kind through shared voluntary efforts, appeals and fundraising events. The end of the war in November 1918 was marked in Cambridge by rowdy festivities and anti-pacifist protests. An effigy of the Kaiser was paraded through the streets on a bayonet and consigned to a public bonfire in the market square. By 1922, a new building for Clare College was underway on land that had once been partly occupied by the First Eastern Hospital. It was to be a permanent memorial to the 197 Clare men who had died. By now, the First Eastern Hospital itself was closed, but this is not the end of its story. After the war, Cambridge found itself in the grip of an acute housing crisis. There were not enough homes for returning servicemen and their families. The lodging houses were needed once again for students. Many were living in appallingly overcrowded and insanitary conditions in housing that had been condemned. In August 1919, the Mayor and members of the Temporary Housing Committee, which included Arthur Negus, the builder of the First Eastern, went to London to persuade the Minister for Health and the War Office that the hospital huts should not be pulled down. Next, they pleaded with King's and Clare colleges, who still owned the land, for permission to convert the huts into temporary council housing, whilst new houses were built. The first tenants moved into the Burrells Walk estate in December 1919. For the next 10 years, it housed several hundred people in 1 to 5 bedroomed living units with communal washhouses and lavatories. There was a constant flow of people, and tenants stayed an average of 2.5 years.
Again, it was a very important and almost unique case, as far as West Cambridge was concerned, of a contribution to solving the problem of housing for the working class. All of that, with one very small exception, all of the working class housing that was built in the interwar period was in East Cambridge.
Edna Walton, who was born in Cambridge in 1916, may be the last person alive today who can actually remember living on the estate, or the hutments as they were known. She, her parents and sister lived in a unit comprising a kitchen, sitting room and 2 bedrooms, made from a converted hospital ward.
Well, my father worked at the bookshop in Rose Crescent, and I think they were the only booksellers in the city centre, so they used to supply all the students, and at the weekends he used to write all the bills out. He didn't work there too long, I don't think, because at one time he was out of work while we were at Burrows Walk, and he took a job on as a milkman. But I can remember his friends coming round and playing cards in the evenings, and because we didn't have any doors on the Burrows Walk, there were curtains, and we could hear all what was going on.
The tenants of the Burrows Walk estate were mostly ignored by their neighbours, the doctors, solicitors and college dons who lived in the large houses on Grange Road and West Road. For Edna Walton, growing up on the estate and enjoying the freedom of the backs was a privilege she has never forgotten.
There wasn't any traffic at all. You could go and play hide and seek behind the trees.
On their way to school in the centre of town, the estate children used to walk through the colleges.
We liked going up the steps and have a smell of the kitchen as we walked through and have a look in the dining room. It was all very awesome. And sometimes if they'd had a ball on or a posh dinner or something, the chef or someone would come out and say, "Would you like some ice cream?" And it was the most gorgeous real strawberry ice cream. I've never tasted anything like it since. I thought it was lovely. I just loved living there. I missed it, when we had to go and live in the street. And we used to go back there quite often and walk up around there. And I was always proud to take my cousins for a walk round the colleges.
By 1924, the land had been acquired as the site of the university's new library, and the days of the Burrows Walk estate were numbered. As the tenants moved out and into brand new council housing, a significant chapter in the history of Cambridge was about to close. The shabby huts, which had borne witness to so much life and death, were taken apart and sold off at auction, although a few were retained for use on the building site. The dismantled hospital wards were reborn in gardens, allotments, schools and villages as sheds, chicken huts, workshops and community halls, part of the new fabric of post-war daily life. As families and communities sought to mend themselves as best they could, they turned their backs on the physical remains of the war and the memories connected with them. And as the years went by, Edna discovered, people preferred not to mention the huts of the Burrows Walk estate.
I didn't realise until a long while afterwards that it had been the first Eastern hospital. I think people didn't want to know that wounded men had been living up there. I don't think they wanted to even think about it.
In his broadcast speech at the opening of the new university library, King George V made no mention at all of the extraordinary hospital he himself had visited on this very spot almost 20 years earlier. To the new generation of undergraduates, Giles Gilbert Scott's quiet and dignified building bore no connection to the trauma of war and its painful narratives. It represented the future, a powerhouse, as the King described it, a testing station of educational activities, a workshop of new knowledge. This is a story of remembrance as well as forgetting. In Great St Mary's, the University Church in the centre of Cambridge, is a table. A plaque tells us it's the handiwork of Rifleman Ashton, wounded in the chest at Ypres in 1915, and made whilst he was a patient in the First Eastern Hospital. Tucked away in the stores of the Museum of Cambridge, formerly the Folk Museum, is a collection of embroideries, meticulously sewn by one or more unknown soldiers during their stay in the great city on the backs. And in a quiet corner of St Botolph's, another city centre church, you can see the war shrine, which was transferred from the hospital chapel after it closed at the end of the war. Whilst the extraordinary story of the First Eastern and its impact on the community of Cambridge has gradually faded from people's memories, St Botolph's Church has helped to keep it alive for almost 100 years. For it's here, every year on Remembrance Day, that the military hospital, its patients, staff and officers are still remembered, and a living link with the past remains unbroken. Perhaps above all, this shrine should remind us of the many untold stories connected with the First Eastern, which are waiting to be uncovered.